In the summer of 1978, 12-year-old Todd Davis was vacationing with his family at a family friend's house just outside of Grants Pass, Oregon. Todd went fishing at a nearby creek by himself and managed to get himself lost in the woods while doing so. As Todd tried to find his way back, he encountered something terrifying while wandering through the wilderness. In today's episode, we will hear Todd's first-hand account of his terrifying encounter with the legendary Bigfoot.
My name is Todd. I am 58 years old and grew up in the Los Angeles area. Lived there pretty much my entire life. Sometime in the early 70s, my mom's best friend Joanne moved from Los Angeles to Oregon with her mother. They moved to a small ranch farm just north of the city of Grants Pass. Beginning in 1974, when I was 8 years old, my mother would take my older sister and I to visit her friend Joanne almost every summer for about 1 to 2 weeks. I was thrilled because I had just started getting into fishing, and living in the city, I didn't get too many opportunities to fish. And Joanne told me there were plenty of places to go fishing near their farm. The first summer we arrived, I was eager to get my line into some water. Upon our arrival, I spent half the night getting my gear ready. I was so excited, sunrise couldn't come fast enough. When morning finally broke, I headed straight out to the pond that was on their property, located next to a fenced-in field. The water looked stagnant and smelled like rotten eggs. The only thing alive in that pond were some tadpoles and some beetle-looking insects that swam up for air once in a while and swam back down. I tried throwing my line in, but had zero luck. I tried worms, crickets, lures, and even put a tadpole on my hook, but I don't believe there was a single fish in that pond. Dejected, I went back to the house and I asked Joanne if there was anywhere else I could go to catch fish. She said there was a small creek just half-mile up the road. I smiled and was getting ready to head straight there until my mom reminded me that I was only 8 years old and wouldn't allow me to go down to the creek. Again, I felt dejected. As a compromise, though, Joanne talked to her neighbor and they allowed me to fish their pond, which was much larger, maybe about an acre or 2 in size, and the water was clean and clear. I must have caught 100 bluegill over the next week and a half, had the time of my life. Threw most of them back, but I kept 3 or 4 alive in an old bathtub, kinda as pets, until it was time to go back to LA. I released them into Joanne's pond, hoping they would populate her pond for the next time we came up. It was 2 years later, when we went back, I was eager to see if those fish survived, but when we arrived, I was disappointed to see that the pond was bone dry. I spent that summer fishing the neighbor's pond again, catching tons of bluegill and the occasional catfish, but that was starting to get a little old. I asked my mom if I could go to the creek, but she said I was still too young to go alone. My mom was quite overprotective. This continued for the next couple of years until finally, in 1978, when I was 12 years old, my mom allowed me to go fishing down by the creek. She told me I could go, but only if I was back before 5 p.m. I said, of course I won't be late, and gathered up my gear and headed down the road. It was a dirt road and was the road that led back to the main road into town. I finally reached the creek where the road passed over it. I fished by the bridge for about an hour, but caught nothing. I decided to head upstream a bit and try my luck. I came upon a small pool and tossed my line in. Almost immediately, I hooked a small trout. It was maybe 5 or 6 inches long. Pretty small, but I was thrilled. My first ever trout. I kept heading upstream, stopping to fish every pool I came upon, until I hooked up with a keeper. It wasn't big, maybe 11 or 12 inches, but to me that was huge. I thought to myself, wouldn't it be great if I could catch enough trout for everyone's dinner? I put that first trout on a stringer and continued upstream. I managed to catch one more about the same size and thought, okay, maybe just 2 or 3 more would be enough to at least make a small meal for my mom, sister, Joanne, and her mother, and me, of course. I kept going upstream, fishing pool after pool with no luck. I finally decided to give up when I realized, hey, I've been fishing for hours. It must be pretty late. I didn't have a watch on me, so I wasn't sure exactly what the time was, but I figured it must be close to 4 p.m. Mom was going to kill me. Since I only had 2 trout, I thought it might be best to just release them. But after a few hours on the stringer, they were both pretty much dead. One looked like its gills were moving a bit, but was pretty certain it wouldn't make it, so I threw the fish into my backpack and started back downstream. I thought to myself that I'll never make it back in time. I came upstream quite a long way. The stream wrapped slowly around a large hill, so my thought was I could just cut over the hill and save some time. I started going up what looked like a small trail. Perhaps it was a game trail. When I got to the top of the hill, the other side went down into a small gully, and then there was another hill beyond. I thought the stream must be beyond the next hill, and I started up that hill. The second hill was much larger and much steeper than the first, but it was getting later and later, so I picked up my pace. The trail started to disappear, and the bushes were getting thicker. I was too concerned about being late, so I pushed on. I pushed up that hill, down the other side, and then up the next. I thought about going back to the stream and just go back downstream, but by this time I was already committed. It would take way too much time going back, so I pressed forward. Fortunately, the undergrowth began to thin out, which made walking easier, but the tree canopy was much denser, which made finding my way much more difficult. By this time, I was hopelessly lost. I felt the urge to panic creep into my body, so I took a deep breath and tried to think things out. It was at that moment I heard rustling off to my left. My first thought was that it must be a raccoon or deer or something. Being a city boy, I really had no idea what it could be. I decided to walk up the next hill and try to gauge where I was at the top. When I got there, all I could see were trees in every direction. I looked toward the sun and figured that must be west because it was getting fairly late in the day. I guessed that the road would be to the east of where I was, so I began walking away from the sun. I heard leaves rustling behind me, so I stopped and stared in that direction. I saw nothing but trees. I decided to pick up my pace and headed east again. That's when I heard footsteps to my right, seeming to parallel me as I walked. When I stopped, the footsteps stopped, and when I began walking, so would the footsteps. I tried walking faster, but because there was no trail, the going was a bit tough. I had to slow down whenever the undergrowth got too thick. When I heard the footsteps again, I stopped and shouted out, "Hello?" I waited a minute, but got no response. I remembered watching the movie Deliverance, which freaked me out, and thinking some hillbilly might be following me. I picked up my pace and kept moving. Sure enough, the footsteps resumed and seemed to easily keep pace with my movements. At one point, I came upon a game trail and I took it running as fast as I could, not noticing if the footsteps were keeping up with me or not. The trail opened out to a field, and I ran out to the middle of it and stopped. I looked behind me to see if anyone was chasing me, but could see nothing. I was well out of breath and had to rest for a little before I could continue. I looked back again to be sure no one was coming, and that's when I saw someone, or something, watching me from behind a large pine tree. The sun was pretty low in the sky, so the figure was backlit, and I couldn't get a good view of its face. It had most of its body behind the tree, with one hand on each side of it. The creature looked to be quite tall, maybe 6 or 7 feet. It was hard for me to guess because it was uphill from me and maybe 60 or 70 feet away. It looked to have brownish hair on its head and arms. The rest of the creature was behind the tree. I thought maybe it was a bear, but really didn't look like one to me. I knew what Bigfoot was because I watched the Leonard Nimoy TV show, but wasn't really thinking about it at the time. I was more concerned that it was a hillbilly stalking me. The creature leaned one way to look around the tree, and after a few seconds leaned over and looked around the other side. I was so scared, I can't even describe it. I knew it would be getting dark soon, and I began to panic again. I slowly began backing away and kept watching the tree, thinking at any moment it was going to come after me. When I got to the other side of the field, the game trail continued on through the woods. I ditched my backpack and my fishing rod, turned and began running down the trail. I ran and ran. For how long or how far I couldn't tell you. It seemed like forever, but probably wasn't as long as I thought. At some point, I could hear running water. I somehow made it back to the creek. It turned out I was only about a quarter mile from the bridge that crossed over the creek. I don't know if that creature followed me at all or stayed up by that clearing. I was just so thankful to be back. As I walked downstream towards the bridge, I heard a huge crack back towards the woods. It sounded like a huge tree splintering. I'm not sure what that was. Again, being a city boy, I wasn't sure if it had anything to do with anything. It was almost 8 p.m. when I got back to the farm. My mom was furious, but I didn't care. I told her what happened, but she was so angry, and I'm certain she didn't believe me, so I didn't press the issue. The next day, Joanne had told me that some of her neighbors had actually seen a Bigfoot before, and that's what she thought it was. After that summer, I never went back up to Oregon again, gave up freshwater fishing as well. I do go fishing out in the ocean once in a while, but never will I go up in the mountains.
Todd never joined his family when they took their yearly trip to visit Joanne in Oregon, choosing to stay with friends in LA instead. Although Todd's mother did not take his story of Bigfoot seriously, the reassurance he received from Joanne regarding his encounter gave the young man some solace. It was nice to at least have some acknowledgement from an adult. Today, Todd still lives in the Southern California area, and true to his word, he avoids wilderness areas and the mountains. This concludes today's episode of The Paranormal Report. If you enjoyed today's episode, please give us a thumbs up and consider subscribing to our channel. It is due to your continued viewership and support that we are able to bring you interesting and informative videos like this. The team here at The Paranormal Report really appreciates your support.